All right, we'll get started in a second. It seems to take a little while for everyone to be let in, so we'll wait for everyone to get in before we start. Okay, hopefully everyone has been let in now. We'll make a start. Welcome everyone to this webinar about the basic education indicators and guidance that we have on indikit.net. My name is Claire Satt. I'm the lead education and emergencies advisor with People in Need. So supporting various of the country programs, including Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Yemen, but also working on their more global agenda as well. And I'm joined here by my colleague Laurel as well, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm Laurel Janzery. I'm also an education emergencies advisor at People in Need, supporting our global initiatives and our country programs. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Laurel, and welcome everyone today, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. So this webinar today is going to introduce you to an M&E, a monitoring and evaluation tool that we've developed at People in Need called Indikit. So it's going to explain basically what Indikit is if you've never come across it before, and it'll talk through the education indicators that we've recently gone through a process of updating, and the guidance that's linked to those on how you can collect the data for those indicators. So hopefully it'll give you a bit of an introduction to the Indikit platform itself and the guidance that is on there, and sort of talk you through some of the ways that it can help with your work as EIE practitioners as well. So I'll hand over to Laurel to give a bit of an introduction to Indikit broadly.
Great, thanks, Claire. So as Claire mentioned, Indikit is a platform that we've created at People in Need, which provides online guidance for the use of humanitarian and development indicators across 24 different topics. So we have a kind of compository of about 50 of the most commonly used indicators for these various, or 500, sorry, of these various topics. And the guidance is based on existing standards, so sphere standards, the INE minimum standards, various UN agencies, and other donors as well. And the point of having this platform is to help practitioners to save time and contribute to better data quality as it's being gathered. We have over 60,000 users annually on the platform, and most of them are coming from the Global South. And the platform itself was developed by People in Need in 2016. And it's available in multiple languages as well. So at the moment, it's available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so Indikit has been designed for various groups of people, including those who are working on proposal writing, those who are designing meal frameworks, preparing surveys, and people who are working to analyze the data that's gathered from the programs. So it's a tool that we use to build the meal capacity of our own internal country offices, but also those of our partners, and it's open source, so it can be used by anybody. And Indikit offers, as I mentioned, wording for 500 different indicators, and the 32 education indicators, which we'll be talking about in more detail today. It offers guidance on how to collect and analyze the data, how to disaggregate the data that you've collected, and it gives important comments, so some practical tips on things to consider or be careful about when you're collecting data for the indicators, and links to additional guidance that can help you understand the indicators better. And I'll hand over to Claire to explain what we've done with the basic education indicators.
Thanks, Laurel. Hopefully that gave a bit of an overview of what Indikit is about. If you didn't catch all of it, don't worry, we will talk through the platform in a minute to show you all of those different points that Laurel just mentioned. As Laurel said, the Indikit platform was developed in 2016, but we've recently gone through a process of updating the basic education indicators. So by basic education, in relation to Indikit, we're talking about primary and secondary education. So there are also vocational education indicators on there, but they don't fall within this webinar. They're separate. So we've updated the basic education indicators, and we now have 32 different indicators across a range of thematic areas within education. And as you can see from this slide, they're organized around the INE minimum standards domains. They're focusing mostly on domain 2, so on access and the learning environment, which also does include protection and well-being, as you probably all know. But for the sake of clarity, we've separated these two out in Indikit because we decided that protection and well-being really did deserve its own focus. So while protection and well-being falls within access and learning environment, in Indikit we've separated it out, and it is a separate area. And then it also includes indicators around domain 3, which is on teaching and learning, and on domain 4, so focusing on teachers and other education personnel. We haven't currently included indicators on domain 1, so on the foundational standards. This is partly because they're covered under some of the cross-cutting indicators that we have already on Indikit. And when we go onto the platform, we can talk you through some of those cross-cutting indicators as well. So you'll kind of see that actually a lot of these foundational standards around coordination and community participation and analysis, they're somewhat covered under some of the indicators we have under those cross-cutting indicators on the platform. And we also haven't currently included indicators on domain 5, which is on education policy. And this is not just to make sure it's clear, this is not because they're not important. Of course they are. But we felt that because the majority of the people who are using the Indikit platform are education practitioners, and we thought that the domains 2, 3, and 4 were kind of the most practical and the most applicable to most organizations like ourselves, like PIN, who are working on education programming. So we're very open to developing some indicators and guidance around education policy, but we didn't prioritize it in this sort of first round. So hopefully we'll be adding those in the future, and would welcome anyone's collaboration on trying to do that. So I'll just talk through briefly the kind of process that we've gone through for developing these education indicators. So this piece of work kind of started back in around 2018, 2019, when INE had a specific working group on monitoring and evaluation. And people in need were part of that working group. And one of the key deliverables that working group had was to develop the INE minimum standards indicator framework. So we were part of that process of developing the INE framework of different indicators that was published in 2021. And that framework aligns the recommended indicators with the INE minimum standards. So this was sort of the base point for us to start working on updating these indicators, was basing it on that indicator framework that INE and this working group put together. And then on the second point here, so we then went through a process of mapping, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but it's basically a process of collecting together all the different indicators that are related to education, both education in emergencies, but also more development-focused education. And we mapped the different indicators from all of these different sources, just to kind of see what indicators already existed, what else was out there, as well as those that INE had put together. And then once we'd done that, we selected the most appropriate indicators from the mapping. So the ones that we felt were the most relevant for education practitioners to use, and the most likely things that people would be trying to measure within their programming. And we tried as much as possible within this to focus on the INE indicator framework. So to base everything that we did off the phrasing of those indicators that had been put together in the framework. So to not create anything new, because we all know there's a lot of indicators already out there from all of these different sources. So we tried to base it as much as possible on the exact phrasing that INE had in those indicators. And then once we had selected the most sort of pertinent indicators, we drafted the guidance to accompany them. So this guidance is, again, we'll go through it a little bit later, but this is basically explaining what data needs to be collected in order to be able to measure that indicator, and then the step-by-step process of how you actually collect that data. And then after doing that drafting process of all of the guidance for each of those 32 indicators, those then went for review by some key education stakeholders. So the indicators themselves and the guidance were reviewed by colleagues from INEE, as well as ECHO and the Global Education Cluster. So this was just a sort of vetting process to make sure that the indicators themselves and the guidance made sense and were practical and relevant to the needs of EIE practitioners. And I'll just focus briefly on the mapping process, just to give an understanding of the kind of scale of the process that we went through. It was quite a comprehensive mapping. So we collected different indicators together from, as I mentioned, the INEE minimum standards, but also very common ones, particularly within humanitarian education, the ECHO indicators we also mapped. Those from the Global Education Cluster, from Education Cannot Wait. We also had a look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators that they have to measure the progress towards those goals. And we included the UNRWA indicators in there because they have quite a comprehensive database of indicators as well. And then very importantly, we wanted to make sure that the child protection minimum standards and their indicators were also included, just to highlight how important child protection is within the education sphere. So we mapped all of these different sort of source indicators across the different INE domains, basically to see where there was overlap between different indicators, where they were trying to measure the same thing or something similar, and also to try and see what the gaps were, to try and identify, where we have indicators to measure our education programs and where there are gaps and things that actually we're not really focusing on and we're not really measuring. So it's to try and identify those gaps that maybe by making Indikit open source, we could try and fill those gaps and make sure that there are indicators for every single topic. I can see a couple of hands up, but we might just wait a few minutes and keep the questions to the end if that's okay. So please do keep your questions in mind. If you want to put them in the Q&A section, that would also be really helpful. And then we can keep track of the questions that are coming and make sure we have time to answer them all at the end. And I think I mentioned already, we tried to focus this as much as possible on the INE indicators to ensure that everything on Indikit is aligned to the minimum standards. But in some cases, we did find that other indicators were either more relevant or more straightforward to collect data on. So in some cases, we have used other indicator sources. So you'll see when we talk you through the platform that as well as INE indicator phrasing, we also have indicators directly from ECHO's Education and Emergencies indicators, plus some PIN custom indicators that we put together to try and fill some of those gaps that I was mentioning before. Okay, and we're going to take a bit of time now to actually look at the platform itself. So to put all of this stuff, sort of put a face to everything that we've just talked about. We'll talk you through indikit.net, and you can find it yourselves as well on this website that is on the slide. So www.indikit.net, and then for education /education. So we'll just talk you through what is on the platform to give you a bit of a clearer idea of what it includes. So once you get onto indikit.net, if you don't put the /education in, it takes you to this main page, and you can see on here that there are kind of two layers of the home page. So these are all indicators for both relief and development projects. So for humanitarian contexts, as well as more development-focused programming. And you'll see here there are two options. The first on sectoral indicators. So I think we mentioned at the beginning that education is just part of Indikit. There's also indicators on all of these different sectors. So nutrition, food, WASH, maternal health and child health. I mentioned earlier about vocational education as well, shelter, all of these different sectors, some of which are really relevant to education and can be kind of used within an education project. So for example, if you're trying to measure children's nutrition levels, there will be indicators under nutrition that are also relevant for education if you're doing school feeding, for example. So a lot of them are still relevant to education, particularly things like nutrition, like WASH, even income and employment in some cases. And then the second part of the website is on cross-cutting indicators that we talked about a bit earlier. So these are all the sort of cross-cutting themes that cut across all of those different sectors that we just saw. So these are things like environmental mainstreaming, social behavior change, gender and age mainstreaming. Really important protection mainstreaming is also included here and super relevant for education. Most of these do have a relevance to education as well. So if there are areas where you're looking at measuring something that is a bit more cross-cutting, but isn't included in the education indicators themselves, you can always have a look on here and see if there are any indicators that might be relevant in terms of targeting or greening schools or how you're communicating or coordinating with communities. So there's, all of these different cross-cutting indicators. I think pretty much all of them are relevant to education. So do take some time to have a look at those as well. And then if we have a look specifically at the sectoral section, so to access the education indicators, you click on Basic Education. And then you'll see on this page that the indicators are divided by the I&E domains 2, 3, and 4 that we talked about just now. So access and learning environment. We mentioned protection and well-being, which comes under access and learning environment. And then domain 3, teaching and learning, and domain 4, teachers and other education personnel. And you can see here that it only shows a few of the indicators to begin with, but if you click on show the other indicators, you'll get the full list of which indicator titles fall under each of those different domains. And within these, so domain 2, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the I&E standards and the domains, but domain 2, access and learning environment. So this covers equal access and facilities and services. So everything related to access to education and the school facilities and services themselves. And then psychosocial support and well-being, as we said, is separated out. So that covers everything related to protection and well-being. And then domain 3, teaching and learning. So this covers everything related to curricula, training, teacher professional development and support, instruction and learning processes, and the assessment of learning outcomes as well. So this is quite a big domain with a lot of content in there. And then domain 4, so the teachers and other education personnel. This covers everything related to teacher recruitment and selection, the conditions of work for teachers and volunteers and facilitators, education personnel in general, and the support and supervision. And I mentioned already that domains 1 and 5 are not currently included in here. But as I mentioned, in those cross-cutting indicators, you will find some of those areas around coordination and community participation. They're covered under the cross-cutting indicators. So they are available, just not directly under education. And then on the platform, you're able to filter by different filter options. So this is to try and help you to be able to find the indicator that you're looking for more easily. So for example, you can filter by result area. So selecting any of these filters that you want. So whether it's access or facilities or inclusive learning environments, improved quality of education. So we can just show what comes up if you click on one of these, for example. So if you click on improved quality of education, it filters out the indicators that specifically refer to the quality of education. And then you can also filter by indicator level. So this basically shows you which indicators are output level indicators, so measuring the outputs of a project, or outcome related, so measuring the sort of higher level anticipated outcomes of the project. So sometimes very helpful to divide in that way, especially when it comes to reporting and being accountable to your project proposals and to your donors. And then lastly, you can also filter by the original indicator source. So in this case, although we did all that mapping with all of the different indicator sources, we tried to keep it as simple as possible within Indikit itself to not have too many different indicators in there, because there's a lot of different phrasing and different parameters that each of those different sources want to measure. So you'll see, as we've mentioned multiple times, the majority of the indicators are directly linked to the INE indicator framework. So 26 of the 32 are directly INE indicators from their framework. And then we have a few that are echo and a few that are custom pin indicators that are filling some of the gaps in that mapping. So we can have a quick look at an echo indicator just as an example. So we just want to talk you briefly through the kind of guidance that you'll find on Indikit. So we can look at transition to formal education or transition to further non-formal education as an example. So each indicator page is set up in the same way. So you have the overall topic, so transition to formal education in this case. You have the indicator phrasing, the wording of it. So what exactly is the indicator? Like what is a good wording to use for this indicator? So in this case, it was measuring the percentage of targeted girls and boys who transition either into formal education from non-formal education, or into the next level of non-formal education, or into the next academic year of formal education. So this indicator in particular does give different options for which of those you measure, or whether you try and measure all three. The next section is always, what is its purpose? So this is obviously explaining what is the indicator used for? Why are we measuring this thing in the first place? So it just gives a brief kind of overview of what the purpose of the indicator is and why we want to measure it. And then it provides some guidance on how to actually collect the data and how to analyze the data that you need to be able to measure that indicator. So in this case, we can run through briefly kind of an example of what sort of guidance you get in there on how to collect the data. So in this case, for measuring transition, it's about deciding the option or the combination of the three options in that indicator you want to measure, whether it's transition into formal education, or transition to the next level of non-formal, or transition into the next academic year of formal education. So firstly, you need to decide which of those you want to measure. Then you determine the point in time at which the data will be collected. So the baseline, when are you going to collect that data? When are you going to collect the end line data? Whether that's at the start of the project and the end of the project, the start of the school year and the end of the school year. So it's just deciding what makes most sense for you in terms of when you actually want to collect that data. And then you'll see point 3 here is about determining the baseline value. So determining how many children are actually enrolled in the school or the learning space at that particular point in time that you've decided. And then you go on to, at the end line stage, gathering the enrollment data from the school or the learning space records to measure how many children have successfully transitioned into the next level, whether it's formal or non-formal. And you'll see that now that we've scrolled down a bit, there's a lot of links that are going on within the guidance itself. So some of the guidance, where it's relevant, it includes a link to some sampling guidance. And hopefully we can just click on this and Laurel can show you a bit about what is included in the sampling guidance in Indikit.
Yeah, so yeah, with these additional kind of resources, there's lots of kind of guidance within it as well. So for example, as Claire said, this guide for sampling, it shows you how to choose who you want to survey, talks about control and comparison groups. It gives some guidance on the type of sample that you might be doing. So whether you're doing simple sampling or cluster sampling, and more explanation of what that means and what the different types of sampling are used for. It also gives you guidance on things like sample size calculation, and definitions of the information that you need to be able to input into a sample size calculator. It also gives you a link to the sample size calculator on the platform, so you can actually calculate your sample sizes right in the platform. And it also gives you some follow-up survey sample sizes and just more guidance about how you would go about doing that.
Nice, thanks, Laurel. And this sample size calculator you can also directly access from the platform itself to help you calculate those sample sizes and what is appropriate for the overall population size that you're targeting. And then you can see here there's also a link to recommended survey questions for measuring the indicator. So Laurel can also show you what happens when you click on that.
Yeah, so there's options. Sorry, I can't see. So there are also options for different survey questions that you can ask to help you measure the indicators. So for example, if you're doing surveys with parents about whether children have transitioned into different stages of education, this additional guidance will offer you questions if you're looking at transition between non-formal to formal education, or whether you're looking at transition between levels of formal education. So it will give you all the guidance that, or the questions that you need to ask to be able to measure the indicator, but it will also give you, in some cases, additional optional survey questions, which can help you gather more data that will be potentially useful for programming. So here, for example, you can see if a parent has answered that their child didn't continue with their education after a school year or a non-formal education cycle, follow-up questions like why did they not transition, but also things around how ready children were to transition. So just additional data that might help you guide your programming. So where relevant, there'll be links to these different survey questions in the different indicators as well.
Great, thanks. And yeah, it does go a little bit beyond the questions that you need specifically for that indicator. But we thought that it was helpful to include some of that extra information because it certainly helped us to guide our programming and understand a little bit more about what the situation is and be able to use that information to target and adapt our programs a bit better. The next section that you get to after it sort of talks you through how to actually collect the data itself. There's always a section on disaggregation and how you should disaggregate the data. This is normally by a few of the basic disaggregation criteria that I'm sure you're all used to doing, disaggregating by age and gender, but there's also some more kind of complex and nuanced factors that you can disaggregate by. So if you click on this disaggregation link, it takes you to some guidance on what you can disaggregate by and how to do that. And Laurel can talk you through this guidance a little bit as well, just to show what's in there.
Yeah, so I won't go through kind of some of the main disaggregation that we all are used to in our programming, but there's some sections on age, gender, disability, and each section will explain to you why you might want to disaggregate the data in this way and how you can do it. And the kind of thing that we want to highlight in this is we've also updated this guidance to include education-specific disaggregation. So in the other criteria section towards the bottom, there's guidance on how you can disaggregate by different types of location, by displacement status, and then we've also added in disaggregation by education levels, mother tongue languages, types of learning spaces and facilities. So it just gives a little bit more guidance on some of the things you might want to consider when you're disaggregating the data beyond the kind of standard disaggregations that we do.
Nice, thanks. So yeah, that guidance on disaggregation is quite comprehensive and should give a bit of an indication of why it's important to disaggregate, but also information on how to actually do that and what kind of factors you can disaggregate by to try and understand your programming a bit better. And then in the bottom of this disaggregation section, you can see it links to a couple of additional tools of how to disaggregate data by disability type. So for example, the Washington Group questionnaires and the UNICEF Child Functioning module. So just some additional resources if you're unsure of how to disaggregate specifically for disability. So some practical tools that can be used to support that. And then we have a section on important comments. So these are sort of comments that are related to the indicator and that will help to guide the collection of the data and make sure that it is accurate. Just things to consider really to make sure that everything is being done in the correct way and that you've considered different factors. So it's not the direct step-by-step guidance that comes above, it's the sort of additional comments and just things to try and keep in mind while you're going through that process. So for example, in the important comments here, this is a relatively brief one compared to some of the other indicators, but just pointing out again that it's an echo KOI indicator, and to make sure that that enrollment data is verified, so that it's actually showing children's attendance in the school and learning space. It's not just about enrollment numbers, it's about attendance. So just some additional guidance on that. And then the important comments always link to related indicators. So this is where all of the extra mapping that we did, this is kind of where this comes in. So you can see that this echo indicator that we've selected on transition, it relates to another echo indicator on retention in education at the end of the project or the school year, whatever period you're measuring. But it also relates to other sources of indicators. So the SDG indicator on completion rates within primary or secondary or upper education. And also another indicator on the number of girls and boys enrolled. So the transition from non-formal to formal or within formal also relates to enrollment rates and that indicator. So it just kind of steers you in, if you've selected that indicator, but maybe there's another one that could be relevant, this is the section that you can look at to see which other indicators might actually be useful. What other wording could we consider if we want to measure something similar but slightly different? So that's sort of what the main indicator and guidance page looks like. So it's the indicator wording, the purpose of the indicator, the guidance on how you collect and analyze that data, as well as all the links to additional guidance on sampling, disaggregation, specific survey questions. And then it goes through the important comments and the practical tips, and the additional resources and related indicators. So that's sort of the setup for every single indicator and guidance. It's always the same layout, so it makes it a bit easier to navigate. So we'll talk you through one other indicator just quite briefly, just to show you some different functionalities, because this one example doesn't include everything. So just to show you another example of the kind of guidance that you can find and the kind of tools that are included. So we'll have a look at access to WASH facilities and the indicator related to access to WASH. So as you saw, that comes under access and learning environment, because it's obviously related to children's access to education, but also the school environment itself. So under this indicator on access to WASH, you'll see you have the same setup, the phrasing, the purpose of the indicator. And we just wanted to show you this one because it links specifically to a tool that we developed at People in Need to support the data collection process. So this tool comes up in a few of the different indicators. And it's a general school checklist. So it's a school and learning space observation checklist. And this checklist is basically there to support you to be able to collect the data that you need. So you kind of have the two options of the survey questions that you can add, or this school and learning space observation checklist, to help you sort of see what kinds of things you should be going and directly observing in the schools or learning space themselves. And it is a full checklist that covers a lot of the different indicators. And Laurel will talk you through it a little bit to show you sort of how you navigate it, and as an example for this indicator, how you find the section on WASH and what kinds of questions it includes.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so as Claire mentioned, this school and learning space observation checklist is quite holistic for any of the indicators on Indikit that we felt had components that could be observable as part of the measurement of the indicator. So it can be used as a standalone per indicator or as a much broader checklist if you're measuring various indicators that are included. So as you're looking at the checklist, it's all based on the domains and the standards, and you'll see the name of the indicator in the left-hand column, and then all questions related to that indicator to the right. So if you're looking specifically for the WASH indicator questions, you can just scroll down to the indicator here. So you see it's INEE indicator 2.7, and there's a number of questions or observations that you can make in the schools that can help you measure whether or not there's adequate access to WASH facilities in the school or learning space. So anything from looking at the number of functioning latrines, whether they're gender segregated, whether they're safe, all of these considerations that would help you to measure the indicator can be answered through some of these questions. So yeah, you can use these set of 5 questions as standalone, or you can incorporate it with some of the other indicators for a more holistic picture of the facilities that you're observing.
Great. Thanks, Laurel. So that's just to give an example of, a tool that you can use to directly observe the schools and learning spaces that you're working in to help you to measure some of these indicators. And then one other sort of function that we wanted to show you is that just to reiterate the importance of people's feedback. And we've obviously gone through quite a comprehensive process as people in need, but also with the support of INE, ECHO, and the global cluster to put these indicators and guidance together and make sure that they're as accurate and as helpful and relevant as possible to all of you, to education practitioners. But we have a section at the end which is super important, that if you go through any of these indicators or guidance and you have any suggestions of how we can improve them, or anything that we should think about changing, or even just to ask if we've considered something that maybe we haven't thought about within that guidance, you can write to us in this suggestion box and just let us know anything that you think is relevant, that you want us to know about. And you just put your name and email address in there, and it sends it to the person who kind of coordinates the whole Indikit platform, and he'll make sure that it gets to us specifically as the education technical people, and we'll be in touch to try and talk through the process of whether we can change things, just to try and take on your suggestions and make sure that we do update these regularly and keep them as relevant and as accurate as possible. So if you're going through any of this and you have a suggestion at any point, please do feel free to reach out to us. We're always open to ideas and changes. So yeah, that's a very important point. And then you'll see this little icon at the bottom. So if you want to print out the guidance, if maybe for your field teams, for example, or maybe there's no access to reliable internet, you can print out the indicator and all of the guidance, or save it as a PDF and share it around with people within your teams. So hopefully that sort of gets over slightly the issue of being able to always have decent and reliable internet connection. And then a couple of other things. We've obviously talked through all of this guidance in English, but it is available in various different languages. So if you want to see the indicator phrasing itself in a different language, there's a direct link underneath. So you can click on See Indicator in other languages, and it'll show it to you in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Czech, because People in Need is a Czech-based organization. So you can see just the indicator phrasing there in other languages. But if you want to have the full complete guidance in any of those 4 languages, you can go into the top right-hand corner of the platform and you can select French, Portuguese, Spanish. There doesn't seem to be a check function on there at the moment, but there will be. So you can have a look at all of the guidance in any of those languages that you choose. Unfortunately, it's not available in all languages at the moment. But hopefully that's something that can be addressed in the future to make sure that it's even more accessible for people who don't speak one of those 4 or 5 languages. And then a couple of other things on the platform itself before we open up to your questions and comments. There is another section on the Indikit platform where you can find additional resources. So just on the top toolbar here where it says resources, if you click on there, it shows additional resources that can be helpful in collecting the data that's related to the indicators. So you can find in here materials for promoting Indikit if you want to just share information about it to other people. So these are slides, banners for social media, email templates, things like that, if you want to share it with your partners or help to promote Indikit. Then there's the sample size calculator that Laurel talked you through earlier. So how to calculate the sample size that you should be aiming for. There's some rapid guides, so rapid monitoring and evaluation guides. So for example, here on disaggregation, which we talked you through a bit earlier, and other things like how to collect, like mobile data collection, how to design smart indicators, describing different survey methodologies, a guide to doing individual interviews. So all sorts of different things here also available in those 4 main languages. And then a bit further down, we have the practical checklists. So these are links to, various checklists. So for example, in quantitative surveys or how to conduct interviews, there's a bit of extra guidance and checklist there for doing various different things. And at the very bottom, you have these quality improvement and verification checklists. So again, just checklists around quality to make sure that you're doing interviews correctly, focus group discussions, etc. So just to be aware that there are a lot of resources on the page that are more around monitoring and evaluation more broadly, rather than just specifically for education. And then also in the top toolbar, you can find links. So this is where you can access links to additional indicators used by different donors, for example, different institutions. So you can access ECHO's indicators here, INPA, BHA, for example, different indicator databases, so directly linking to the SDGs, UNICEF indicators, all of these different things. There's many because it's for all the different sectors that we have on Indikit. And then there's also some links to some emergency and recovery standards. So like linking directly to the SPHERE standards and the INE standards, child protection minimum standards. So kind of things that are related that are useful to kind of see and to know about. And then some extra links to some survey methodologies. And then I think finally, there's one more thing to show you, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, which you might have noticed already, called Your Indikit. So this is, if you want your own version of Indikit, you can learn a bit more about how to do that. So this version of Indikit, as we've said, is developed by people in need for our own internal programming, but actually mostly as an open source resource for other organizations to use. But we're also aware that the indicators that we've selected and the guidance that we've provided isn't necessarily exactly the indicators that other organizations want to measure, or exactly the way that they would collect that data. So it is possible to also have your own version of Indikit as an organization. So this page is basically explaining how different organizations can have their own version of Indikit that's completely adjusted to your specific needs. And various organizations already do have their own version of Indikit. So for example, Save the Children have adapted Indikit for their own purposes. Welthungerhilfe, WHH also have one, Tear Fund, various different organizations. So if you're interested in putting together your own version of Indikit, this is how you find that information and how you can get in touch with us to sort of help you through that process of developing your own Indikit page with your own indicators and guidance. And I think that is a pretty comprehensive look at the platform. So I'll hand over very briefly to Laurel just to go through one more thing, and then we'll have a look at all of your questions and comments, and hopefully we'll have enough time to address some of those.
Great. So kind of just to wrap up and reiterate what Claire mentioned before when we were looking at the platform, but we really want this to be a useful open source resource for anyone who's working in the field of education and emergencies. And so your feedback is really critical for us to make sure that the guidance we're providing is useful and able to be used in the field. So if you are using the platform and you do have any feedback on the indicators once you've used them, or there's anything that might be unclear, please do use that suggestion box to give us that feedback, because it'll only help us to improve the platform for other people as well. And also, if you think, if you've seen the site now and you think it would be helpful for either people in your own organization or maybe partners you work with, if you can share the platform as well with other people, we would really appreciate it. So as Claire said, there are all those resources on how to promote it, but even just sharing the link to the platform with people you think would be able to use it or interested in using it would be really appreciated. So with that, I think that's the end of our presentation. So I think we can go to questions and answers.
Great. We'll try and get through everything. We've got about 15 minutes to go through these. So I'll have a look first at the Q&A. I see that some people have also put a couple of questions in the chat box. So we'll try and work through all of these. So the first question that comes up in the Q&A from Anne is that many of these indicators are quite similar to USAID education indicators. Have these, or are there any plans to map these indicators to other existing donor indicators, or linking the USAID indicators to similar indicators? That's a very good point. We did quite a comprehensive mapping, as you saw, but we didn't actually include USAID in that mapping. So it is definitely something that we could consider to go through the USAID education indicator specifically, because you're absolutely right, it's a super relevant donor. Yeah, we could definitely think about putting those into the indicators, probably not putting in, as you said, they are quite similar already to some of the phrasing that's already there. So probably not putting in USAID indicators directly, but definitely in that section on related indicators, referencing the USAID indicators that are relevant. I think that's a really good point and would be really valuable to those working with USAID funding. So we'll definitely take note of that. Feel free to reach out to us as well. I think my email address was very briefly there on the slide, but you can also pop it in the chat so that people have our contact details. Or like we mentioned, if you want to put it into the suggestion box directly on Indikit, you can also do that. But we'll take note of it and we'll try and address it. And if you check in a few months' time and it's still not there, feel free to reach out and just remind us to do that, because I think you're absolutely right. It could be a really important point to include. Laura, do you want to take any of the other questions?
Sure, sorry, I realized I was on mute. So there's another question about how it handles disaggregation by disability. So the guidance in the indicator will link directly to both the Washington group short set of questions for identifying people with disabilities, but also the child functioning module. So we've left those kind of as the guidance for how to disaggregate by disability, because they're widely used in the sector. So the links for those are in every single indicator, so you can have a direct link to those.
Great. And then we have another question. Would it be correct to clarify that Indikit did not go through a validation process? If it did, how did that process look like? So that's a good question. It depends how we classify validation process. Like, we went through a lot of back and forth with those different stakeholders that we mentioned who reviewed some of the indicators and the guidance. So INE, ECHO, and the global cluster. There wasn't a specific process that sort of said after that review, yes, we, as these key organizations and stakeholders, validate these indicators. But they have been reviewed, so it kind of depends how formally validated we're talking about. But if you're interested in going through that process and different organizations coming together and validating them, we're absolutely open to that. It would be great for us to have more organizations giving inputs and helping to refine these indicators, and then showing that they agree with them and that they support them. So we've somewhat gone through that process in that they've been reviewed by some of the key stakeholders, particularly within humanitarian education. But we'll be happy to do that in a more robust and thorough process if others are open to doing that. It is quite a lot of work. Laurel and I, having spent quite a long time putting these indicators together, even just reviewing them is a huge piece of work to go through and add comments and validate. But yes, we're absolutely open to doing that more formally if it would be desired by others. Laurel, any other questions you want to jump in on?
Sure. There's a few questions on what's available in terms of looking at safe school data. So just to share that there's maybe I can quickly share my screen again. There's an indicator on adequate school or learning space infrastructure that's similarly related to this. So especially in the kind of observation checklist section for that indicator, there's a lot of questions about school safety, not specifically related to back to school post-crises, but things that should be considered to ensure schools are safe learning environments for children prior to them returning to school. And there was also a question about this checklist and whether or not photos could be uploaded as well to show some of the observations that were done. There's not a specific section for it, but you could always, especially if you have this in Word document form, kind of this, the column on the right is for kind of notes and things. You could always add photos there as well. So as you're going through, you could either include links to the photos or the photos themselves in this comment section to really highlight some of the findings from the observations.
Great. And then there's a question on, do we have any indicators on remote teaching? So it'd be interesting to know that some suggestions on indicators on remote teaching. I think a lot of the indicators that are there kind of relate to both in-person and remote teaching and hybrid teaching. I don't think that there is a specific one on remote teaching. It kind of depends on what is being measured in relation to remote teaching. Like I said, some of them are relevant for both, like when it comes to access and enrollment and transition and things like that. They're kind of relevant for both. There's, I think probably in the important comments, there are some that mention ways that you could work around if it's not in-person teaching, ways that you could measure for remote. But yeah, there's nothing specific that is on remote teaching in and of itself. But if you have some suggestions for indicators that you think would be relevant for remote teaching, please do reach out to us. We'll put in the suggestion box, and we can try and add those in because it is somewhat covered, but not specifically. So we'd be very open to any new suggestions on it.
Yeah, I think there's also a question around human rights standards and any notes on things and considerations maybe that need to be taken into account when measuring the indicators. So if we felt that there were things that really you needed to take into consideration while you're planning how you're going to collect the data, it's all in the important comments section. So that section will have things about conflict sensitivity in certain cases, depending on the data that you're gathering, or considerations like that need to be taken into account. when you're collecting it. So anything related to that would be in the important comments section for every indicator.
Mm-hmm. There are also some separate indicators around rights that come up in the cross-cutting indicator section. So not directly linked, but things like awareness of rights, communication trustworthiness, what preferred language people want to receive their information through, and the preferred channel they want to receive their information through. So sort of things around how people want to kind of work together. There are a few of those in the cross-cutting issues. Which kind of loosely relate, but are a bit more sort of rights focused.
Mm-hmm. And I think the last question is about translation into Burmese or other languages. I don't think at the moment that there's any plans to translate these into other languages, mainly because we have 500 indicators on the platform. And I can say from going through this process of translation, only for the 32 indicators that we've updated, the process is quite long and arduous. So at the moment, I think we've stuck to these kind of 4 key languages. But if anybody does start doing some work in these indicators and they're translating some of them, we'd be happy to link them on the page, the translations, so that other people can access them. But at the moment, I don't think there's any plans to translate into any other languages.
No, but a good point that you can, you can sort of download and print the indicator in the guidance. So if you wanted to do your own translation of a couple of the indicators that are most relevant to you, then you're absolutely free to do that. And yeah, we'd love to hear back from you if you do translate it into Burmese or any other languages, because we also work in Myanmar. So it would be super helpful to have that as well. I think that's all the questions, unless
there is the last question on
there is.
Yes, on blended learning.
On blended learning. Yeah, probably a similar response that I gave about remote learning. So a lot of them are relevant to blended learning, and there is some guidance on sort of different ways that you can do it for different learning modalities, whether it's in person or remote or hybrid or blended learning. So kind of as with the answer on remote learning, I don't think there's a specific indicator that's looking at blended learning, but a lot of them are applicable for the different types of learning modality. I don't know, Laurel, if you wanted to add anything else on that.
No, I think you've got it covered.
Yeah, but again, if you have some suggestions on the kind of indicators that you would like to measure when it comes to blended learning, feel free to suggest, and we're always open to adding additional indicators that are going to be useful for people. And I think in this day and age, both remote and blended learning are super relevant for many of us. So we'd be very open to that. I think we're a minute from time. So maybe just to point out in the chat that Ione would appreciate if you can take a couple of minutes of your time to fill in a survey. And there's a link in the chat box. So for those of you who like to do surveys and have a couple of minutes free at the end, I'm sure they would really appreciate if you can fill that in. Otherwise, I think all that's left to say is thank you so much for your time, for participating, for listening. It's a lot of information. Hopefully you've gone away with a bit more knowledge about Indikit and how it works. And I think the main point we want to share with you is that we want to hear from you. So please use it. And if you do have feedback on it, please get in touch with us and let us know, because we're always wanting to improve. So reach out at any point and we'd be very happy to have a discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. And I've put our emails in the chat. So as Claire said, please do feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or anything. And thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day, however long that is. Take care.
Thank you.